Courtney, aren't you proud of me? All right. So this is it's funny. Again, I guess this is one of those areas where uh I argue that this stuff isn't the most romantic and sexy stuff in the world when it comes to political science. Um but at the same time, as the poli sci nerd that I am, the truth is I think this stuff is essential. Um I don't An analogy I use is everybody loves to watch a car race, watch the cars go fast, watch the race on a Saturday or a Sunday. That's all well and good. But the real meat and potatoes of the event is everything that goes into place Monday through Friday. Fixing and tuning the cars, testing the process. What is a car? How does it run? So to me, that's what examining government is. You want to know what's going on Monday through Friday at the races and not just Saturday when they're actually on the track. And so when we look at something like Congress, we're really trying to get an understanding of what is their role. Just like when we talked about the presidency, all right, the presidency really plays a specific role in American government. And it's not just that that role has been so clearly and distinctly defined within documents like the Constitution. The uniqueness of the American government is the degree to which these different positions, these different branches must share power. If there's one thing I want you to take away, the US Revolution, the US movement to independence and establishment of the government really altered what the rest of societies around the world came to understand to be government. I don't know if any of you have ever studied the Vietnam War, or maybe even just learned a little bit. Maybe you have family members that maybe are veterans of the Vietnam War. Well, one of the things that always struck me is I grew up understanding the Vietnam War was very clearly the communists against the capitalists. It was us against them. And I was kind of struck when I realized, or when I learned, that Ho Chi Minh, who was the president of North Vietnam when they first gained their independence and the war really started, he travels down to Saigon and or yes, I'm sorry, Hanoi, excuse me. He travels to Hanoi to give his welcome speech, his kind of inaugural speech, and he basically copies the Declaration of Independence word for word. He was a communist. He was one of the most important. All he did was change a couple of the names, but in the end, the ideals that were put out in the Declaration of Independence were as salient to communists and socialists during the Cold War as they were to Democrats and supporters of democracy. And so it's important to understand the structures of our government, not just to understand our government, but then to understand how it's actually impacted the development of governments around the world. And so when we look at the foundations of the American government, especially Congress, you have to begin with the understanding that was the first branch of government. I'm hoping that, again, this reinforcing component of my pedagogy is just a philosophy of teaching, how you teach. And my pedagogy is layered. Try and add pieces so that the original pieces I've laid out make sense now. So the Articles of Confederation discussion we had, the discussion about the compromises during the Constitutional Convention, all of that stuff should start to now filter into an understanding now. The Articles of Confederation established the Congress. The only branch of government that was established through the Articles of Confederation was the legislative branch. So it's important that you remember their whole goal when we're talking about government structure was a very simple layer: federal government, state governments, but all those state governments are going to have the power. And the only way to make sure that happens is the legislative branch. The federal government in general is weak. Because remember, even at this time, Congress was nothing but the individuals chosen and or elected at the state level sent to represent those states. So they weren't acting independently, you know what I mean, like Congress does today relative to certain. No, they were there purely to represent the state interests. And so the states had complete control within their territory, and they also had the significant amount of control of the federal government as we understood it. So in the end, their mind was, listen, all the government, and again, when they think government, all they're thinking is Congress. All the government should be able to do is make war and peace, send and receive ambassadors. They should be the ones that sign treaties with other countries, and eventually they said, okay, Congress should have the right to borrow money. But even in the very first go around, there was no guarantee of Congress the right to borrow money. They actually had to fight for that to a degree, especially later on when it came to establishing a federal bank. So, in the end, it's important to remember that the first steps in developing the American government system as we understand it today were focused, excuse me, on one goal: limit federal power. That was the goal. They Now it was balanced, to be clear. They knew they needed a government. Okay. There was some who actually said, why don't we just go with 13 independent governments and call ourselves an association? That was, for instance, how they did it in Germany up until the 1800s, late 1800s. But no, they put together one government and said, okay, let's just make sure we limit the powers of the federal government if we're going to create it. Well, as I've discussed in the past, that did not work well for them. The federal government simply did not have enough power and enough focus and direction to get what needed to get done. And so they call this constitutional convention. And remember again, their original goal when they called the constitutional convention was to simply fix the Articles of Confederation. It was only after the first week or two of discussions that they realized it was unfixable. They were going to need to start from scratch. And so that's when we start to talk about things like the Connecticut Compromise. Because one of the issues, one of the primary debates that they had during the convention was how are we going to split or establish representation of the states within the federal government? And again, we've talked about this, so I'm not going to spend too much time about it, but there was one plan that was put out there, specifically a plan by states that had large populations, right? States like Virginia. And they argued, well, representation in this new legislature should be driven by population. Everybody, if you have more people, then you should have more say. Well, the smaller states like New Jersey, and when I say smaller, I mean population, their argument was no, no, this should be equal. We should have some system in which the states themselves have equal representation within this new government. The compromise, let's do both. And that's how we have the bicameral Congress that we see today. Over time, they eventually passed a law capping the total number of representatives. This is important. In the beginning, as your state's population grew, you got more representatives, right? In the Senate, it's 2 per. That was the part of the New Jersey plan. Straight equality of representation, proportional representation is the House of Representatives. That's the one that was increasing as the state populations grew because more people, more representatives. There was suddenly a realization that as not only we were adding more states, but those states were also gaining in population, we could be looking at 6, 7, 800 representatives. And so they actually passed a law capping the number. Why is that important? Now it's not a matter of how many people you have in your state. Now it's about how many people you have in your state relative to other states. That's the term apportionment. That means how are we going to distribute this limited number? Is this making sense? I hope I'm not going too fast. So the number is never going to be higher than 435. So it's not just if Southern states would definitely love to have some increased representation in Congress, but it's not just about getting more people to move to the South and increasing their population. There you go, get more representatives. It's always going to be relative to the populations in states like California and New York. Go ahead, Crystal.
Was that word you used, apportionment, like with an A?
Yes. How do we distribute a portion? How do we distribute what is a clearly under, it is a one size pie, 435 slices. How are we splitting up all those slices? And again, what I'm saying is earlier on, there was no pan. The pie was just allowed to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. However many slices, that's the population. That's it. So once they realized that that was going to get out of control, that's when they put that break in place. Any questions on the basic structure of Congress? And again, just to lay that out there, there is no specific summary slide on this, so I'll be sure to highlight the things you need to remember. Bicameral legislature. Bicameral legislature. That is 2 houses. Okay, and if you remember, again, this is something I talked about way back when I was talking about traditions that we brought over from the English, and the idea that they have the upper and lower house, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. That's basically what we have here. Upper and lower house, only we call it the House of Representatives and the Senate. But the psychology behind it, right? The representatives or the emotional junior political representatives tend to be more radical, blah, blah, blah. The senators are supposed to be older, more wise, less emotional. Same thing in the House of Lords, House of Commons. The other key concept I would take away is the Connecticut Compromise. Make sure you understand that. If in my mind, if there was a essay question on a final exam that asked about the Connecticut Compromise, the B answer is an explanation of it. The A answer is including things like the Virginia Plan, New Jersey Plan. Questions? All right. So again, why bicameral? Because we stole the idea. The truth is that we invent a lot of stuff, but one of the things Americans are also really good at is taking ideas and things from other societies and cultures and shaping them in ways that fit our culture. And I think basically you could make an argument that government structure is absolutely one of them. As much as there are components of the American government and political systems that were invented out of whole cloth, absolutely. There's also the idea that in the end, the reason why we were able to invent that cloth like that was because we really had a nice framework of ideas and different things that we had taken from other societies. As much as, for instance, we had taken the structure of government from the English, we're very much influenced by the philosophies of French thinkers. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I mean, father of liberty, the very notion of what liberty is, a lot of that is French thinking, not English thinking. And so if in our minds, if it was good, we were going to take it. So from the practical perspective, there needed to be a compromise. We, I think one of the things that highlights how disruptive and how me versus you American politics is today is the reality that the concept of political compromise is baked into the very notion of American politics. And so the reason I think a
For the
lot of
night.
hello, oh, I think the reason a lot of Americans are taken aback by the conflict in American politics today is precisely because most of these stories, I mean, we're literally talking about back to the origins of the country. The stories are based upon the concept of compromise. Is this making sense? Let me put this another way,
Yes.
right? The Napoleonic era, there was no compromising. It was who had the strongest army. Why does the Civil War stick in our minds? Obviously, abolition of slavery, but because we don't do it that way. We had a civil war. We actually fought each other on the battlefield for 4 years because we couldn't compromise. Wow, that slavery thing must have been a really big deal because we tend to compromise over just about everything else. Does that make sense, or am I being too idealistic?
It makes sense.
What do you guys
Yeah,
think?
it makes sense.
Thoughts, ideas?
I think it's pretty significant. The country had to fight a civil war to end the monstrosity.
It was,
It's significant.
it's again, I don't know. I think I've told you guys I've literally made entire courses just on the Civil War. I've taught it from a purely military perspective, political perspective, interdisciplinary. I've always been fascinated by I so first and foremost, I find that the Civil War, World War II, and the Vietnam War to be the three most single important points in American history. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that, but then the way I think and the way I look at things, I have to step back and say, well, why are the most important points in American history wars? What's interesting about the society is as much as we focus on political compromise, um, we are also born of and advance through conflict. We always have. The greatest moments in American history, I mean, it wasn't until what, Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter? No, even Jimmy Carter. It wasn't until Bill Clinton that we had a president that wasn't also a former military, and there was a lot of pushback on that. The idea that how could you not have a guy with military experience as the, um, you know, commander in chief? And so we've always had this strange relationship with the idea of political compromise, and we all get together, and the melting pot that is American culture, with the idea of most of our advancements, and in fact, the very notion of us being the superpower today is driven by our successes born of conflict. And I see those as two kind of competing themes in American history. Even I see that within the Black community, within the white community, between those communities. I see it as something that drives women in terms of this tension between progress and the advancement versus recognition of another group that says, what is tradition? How do I define woman? So I just find this interesting tension between conflict and compromise within American society that really goes back to this, and ultimately continues to evolve and shape what we understand to be the operations of our government and our politics. I mean, everything I just said, tell me that's not the Congress today. I mean, and here's the thing. It doesn't matter if it is the Trump administration or the Biden administration. When you watch, oh, damn it. All right. We know we have to get an infrastructure bill done. We know we have to make compromises on this. But damn it, I don't like that guy over there over on the other side of the aisle. And I'm just going to make sure I fight him down. I'm going to, work I can to get whatever I can do to get him not elected in the next. It's this constant tension. And yeah, I don't pretend to have answers to it, but to me, at least we can start looking at it if we recognize what it is. All right, I'll stop preaching. What do you think, guys? Thoughts?
I think that plays into a lot of why people feel like they don't do work per se. I read that article yesterday that you had posted, and I found that interesting because I don't personally feel like Congress just doesn't work. I feel like because there's like the one side and the other side, and I feel like that tension, and I think that's what kind of gets in the way a lot.
I check. Yeah, and it's another thing. It's kind of interesting. Um, how the American citizen viewing Congress defines the concept of work is fundamentally different from how they define it. So when I talk about the conflict aspect, for instance, I am doing significant work if I simply stop you from passing a bill. Literally, I've done a great job because nothing got done. That's a part of the process. And so if you step back and look, one of the hardest things I think Americans do is to put themselves, we all say, oh, you need to put yourself in another person's shoes. No, do it. Do it. You know, my wife was telling me a story the other day about when because we met in a restaurant I don't think we literally met in a restaurant. She was my trainer on the floor. I was first just got hired. And so she would purposely give me things to do when she knew I didn't know where the stuff was, and then she'd stand in the corner and laugh at me and watch me. So that's how we got along and started. So the joke is that she's been training me now for 21 years, and I still don't get some of this stuff. But what the reason I bring it up is because it's it's important to understand that when you're looking at something from the outside, you don't always see the motivations and the intentions behind it. So yes, I absolutely think that the Trump party, the Trump supporters in Congress previous 4 years were obstructionist, that they were stopping certain things that needed to get done from being done. And that would absolutely lead me to think that Congress is a joke and they're not doing any work. But if I step back for a moment, I put myself in the shoes of a conservative, of a real conservative Trump support, and I've done this, okay? I cannot talk about Trump supporters. I can't claim to have these positions without understanding the fundamental basis of them. So what does it mean to be a Trump supporter? How do you measure the concept of success? Not for nothing, the average Trump supporter is going to look at the Trump administration and 4 years of Congress as one of the most successful tenures you could ask for. Between the Supreme Court, between the blocking of certain progressive and liberal ideas and concepts, between the overall promotion of certain policies that are fundamental to conservatism, from business to tax changes. Listen, how I feel about it is one thing, but I can't just sit back and claim it's an objective failure, because that's not the truth. There's a whole lot of people that are going to see the operations and activities of Congress a variety of different ways. That's how I approach it. So is Congress as effective as it could be? Absolutely not. But I'm not one of those guys that claims it's just a mess. We should blow it up. We should charge and bust down the doors and look for Nancy Pelosi. Like, to me, that was one of the most abhorrent. I yeah. There's a lot of ways I've come to look at that. I actually think the Capitol issue is the great paradox in the conservative ideology. Conservatism loves law enforcement. They love law and order. It's a bedrock of conservatism in American politics. But they hate the people that make the laws. There's the paradox. How can you love the people that enforce them and hate the people that make them? So it's hard for me to understand your position when you're charging the Capitol building as a form of patriotism and then knocking a cop in the head with a baton. Which is it? Like, that was what struck me about the whole Capitol incident.
I question something. And
Shoot.
I'm just questioning. And like I said before, I'm not the person, this is not my subject. But
Yeah, go ahead.
you bring this topic up a lot, like every lecture, the Capitol insurrection. Was it really an insurrection? Like, I feel like they were let in.
That's
And
an
I mean,
interesting point.
it was on, it's on the news and stuff, that I sometimes watch. But one of the guys that was actually in there, or a lot of the people actually claimed to be Trump supporters, but they weren't.
Well, so there's a lot of different perspectives. And so let me say again, I know there are absolutely charged emotions on both sides. And
Right.
so I'm not trying to teach you what to think here. I think I've been pretty clear. Like, I try very hard to separate my own perspectives from what I think you need to know, understanding this.
You're the equal opportunity annoyer.
Yeah, you remembered. Are you kidding me? Do you know how aggravating I am to some some true African American perspectives and ideas? Like, I have same disruptive, because I engage critical race theory, okay, and a lot of my work engages it, but I don't engage it the same way because I learned critical theory as a political scientist. And so race is just one way to apply critical theory. It's not a single thing. But when I start explaining that to some people, they're like, well, which is it, man? So okay, here's where I would start. Honestly, this is how I think. My very first thought is I better look up the definition of insurrection. So at least I'm starting with a basic objective framework, because whether you loved what happened or you hated what happened, here is the legal definition we all started with. So that's how I started it. And then I sit back, I three-pronged approach. It's actually called the triangle of identity, but bear with me. What is your perception of what happened? What is the perception of those who agree with you about what happened? Is there a synchronous? So, for instance, the first thing I notice is that certain people that think they're representing conservatives or liberals or law enforcement or politicians on that perspective, it was a terrible day, it was a patriotic day, whatever it is, they're not even always aligning with the groups they say they're symbolizing. All of a sudden, the group goes, no, that's not what you know what I mean? Like, differences between individual politicians and what the political party is saying, for instance. Is that making sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a third leg to understanding. What do the people that don't agree with me say happened? And I have to engage each of those points critically, almost like, so the way I do it, my writing, I write what I'm going to write. and then I literally step away from the computer, do something else that's going to completely wipe my mind, play some Xbox for a while, make dinner. When I sit down, I look at it as if I've never written it. I look at it with a different set of eyes. I need to be as critical as possible. So for instance, when I'm setting up the classes in Canvas, I look at it in my view, and then there's a little button that says student view. So then I can flip over and see everything I've just done from how you're going to see it. And if I don't hit that button, I'm making mistake after mistake. My problem with American politics is not whether you agree or disagree with Trump, whether you think it was an insurrection or a patriotic element. My problem with American politics today is everyone's stopping with that first dot. That's my problem. And everybody thinks that critical thinking is me trying to convince you you're wrong. Critical thinking is reinforcing what you understand. It's
Mhm.
it's about finding more evidence to support your position while at the same time being willing to accept that if you don't find that evidence, you might be wrong. That's all it is. And so
Mhm.
in the end, I do think it was an insurrection, not because I hate Trump, not because what I saw bothered me, and it did, but because legally speaking, it fits the definition. And what's my evidence? 2/3 of the individuals that were charged in association with the insurrection have already pled. Even the people involved in the incident have admitted that it was wrong. I I don't know where else to go from that. Now, the severity of the wrongness, what we should do to make sure it doesn't happen again, what it means for American politics, what it means for Trump's legacy. Man, that's like 5 different lectures. You know what I'm saying? But if you're just asking me, do I think it was an insurrection? I absolutely think it was not only an insurrection, but a demonstration of many of the deep cultural divides we have in this country. Because you will forgive me, if it was a different looking group, that would have been a dark, excuse the phrasing, day in
Mhm.
America indeed.
Right.
The level of violence that might have broken out had that been a different group, I don't even want to think about how that day could have turned out. Never
Right.
mind. To flip it around, I'll
Mhm.
be perfectly honest with you. I am shocked that more damage wasn't done inside the Capitol. If it had been a traditional type protest, it it would have been mayhem.
Mhm.
I so I mean, there are all sorts of different ways to look at it, and that's how I look at this stuff. I do not just go okay and then move on. To
Mhm.
to to end this up, and for the record, Courtney, awesome question, because that's the reality of everything I've been trying to teach is the idea that, man, talking about a bunch of stodgy dudes sitting in Philadelphia writing the Constitution, all that, no, it still matters. It literally impacts what we understand to be American politics today. And so yeah, I really appreciate you throwing that down. That was a good
Mhm.
question. All right, when we're talking about congressional leadership, I think actually, to keep bringing this around, I think this part of the design has been clearly evident as essential to American politics throughout the most recent, Trump, Obama, all of them. The idea of who leads the House is critically important. And so the House of Representatives is led by the individual who's called the Speaker of the House. Okay. The Speaker of the House is generally the strongest individual within the dominant party. Okay, so when the Democrats have the dominant number in the House, the Speaker of the House is a Democrat. They preside over the House. This word preside, draw a little arrow, break it down, whatever you have to do. Here's what that means. And it's 3 simple things. One of them's not here, and that's why I want to make sure you break this down, but you'll understand the amount of power this means. First, they make the agenda. The Speaker of the House makes the agenda. What that means is they decide what is and what isn't going to be considered by the House. It's that isn't part that's where you really get the power. We were talking earlier about some people's perception that the Congress doesn't do any work. Man, I don't want to talk about impeachment right now. It's not on the agenda. Next. Now, half of America is going, Congress doesn't do anything. Other half of America is going, great job. It's exactly what I elected you for. Thank you very much. So again, to me, we can't just assume that they're not doing their The problem with Congress is not that they're not moving forward. The problem with Congress is every 4 years that damn wheel's getting yanked all the way to the right, all the way to the left. They're swerving down the road like drunk drivers. That's the problem. But they're moving forward. It just ain't straight. So the second power, right? The first power is making the agenda, deciding what is and is not considered by the entire House. The second power is they shape the committees. So to put this in perspective, you may or may not be familiar, Courtney, one of the things that's been considered is this: should there be an investigation of the insurrection, right? There's been this back and forth. Ultimately, it was defeated in the Senate, but it moved forward in the House. Why? Because the House Speaker is a Democrat, Pelosi, got it on the agenda, bing, bang, boom, right? In the Senate, they don't have that same ability. So now they're talking about maybe doing it through a committee. That you end up with these different approaches in the different houses precisely because who the leader is. The third major power of the speaker is that they become sort of the the first word that came to mind was dictator. That's not the right word, but they control the party. Pelosi controls all the party members, all of the Democrats in the House. And when I say control, you got to check with her on just about every major political move you might try and make. Now, it doesn't mean that you're always going to toe the line, but if you don't, then what she does is she sends these people down called whips. The whip does what the name sounds like. It whips you into line. They're the ones that come to your office and say, hey, Nancy Pelosi is really trying to get this infrastructure bill through, and I hear that you're not sure you're going to support it. Do you know what the DNC gave your candidacy last year when you ran for office? Because that money might not be available next year. So if you're going to, start blocking what Pelosi wants to do for the party, just understand there's going to be repercussions. Now, one of the interesting aspects of that relationship is that traditionally the relationship falls on the majority leader, i.e., Speaker of the House, and their ability to control the money associated with the party apparatus. Because I'm running Republican things, or because I'm in charge of Democratic things, when you, Sarah, run for your office, you're going to have to come to me for money, for volunteers on the phones, for all that stuff. And if you don't play ball with me, it says Democrat, so do the Democrat thing and line up. That's how I pressure you. What was interesting about Trump is I'm telling you, I've studied this stuff for a long time. I don't want to say it's an absolute, but here it is. It is one of the first times I ever saw a politician elevate that power above the party. So now it wasn't a matter of you better toe the line or else the Democratic Party or the Republican Party won't support you. The issue was if you don't toe the line, Trump is going to bury you. Not only will he not support you through the party, but he will go out and find people to run against you. That's next level bullying, if you will, relative to the American political system. That's the kind of stuff that hasn't really taken place since the 1920s and the corrupt politics of like Chicago. I mean, it was a different approach, and not for nothing, Trump had so much support that he's still able to do it even now that he's out of office. It's amazing. Again, I'm a, and again, this frustrates some people. I can look at a person, at a system, and I can always see both sides of it. Okay, so again, as much as I personally might have disagreed with Trump, I don't know any politician or leader in the world who wouldn't want a similar level of loyalty from his followers that Trump gets on a daily basis. It is absolutely amazing. If you're a politician or a leader, I'm working in the dean's office right now. Man, if I knew I could rely on all of my staff to follow my vision and what in the exact way that he's able to get, man, the things I could do, not even going to lie. So just looking at everything in both directions is really important, especially when you're looking at things like how Congress is affected by leadership. In the Senate, it's a little bit different because rather than a Speaker of the House, the Vice President is actually the leader of the Senate. So it's a little bit more it's a little bit more of a ceremonial or a symbolic position, but it does have one specific point or reason why. Because in the end, the vice president has the power to cast an additional vote in the Senate if there's a tie. That was built in there precisely because of the proportional of the equal representation, right? If you accept equal representation, then you're always going to have an even number of representatives, which means you have a vastly increased potential for a tie vote. Because of that, there needs to be a built-in tiebreaker. We make the vice president the president, quote unquote, for the time being of the Senate, and then he or she steps in, casts that deciding vote, boom. So technically speaking, it gives a little bit of an advantage to the dominant party, whoever's party got their presidential candidate elected. By definition, now that's going to be the party head for the vice president. So now that party has the deciding vote in the Senate. So Kamala Harris, she's going to have the deciding vote in the Senate for the next 4 years. And there are a variety of reasons to think that there's going to be quite a few ties, or at least potentially quite a few ties within Senate votes on really key issues. Everything from the investigation of the Capitol Hill incident to the I think the biggest fight coming up is going to be the infrastructure bill and the amount of money that needs to be spent to fix the infrastructure in the United States. And as I sit here with my crappy ass internet trying to get good signals, everyone can understand that, better signals, better roads. What do they estimate? 30% of all bridges in the United States are past the point at which they should be torn down or rebuilt. And so these sorts of things are going to, you want to understand the weaknesses of our infrastructure. Look at what happened in Texas over the winter when all their power went out. What did they have, a deep freeze like two? And I mean, those are things that could happen around the country. You know what I mean? And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And ironically, it is going to require a lot of compromise. This is just an overview of a lot of different things we've talked about. I find this to be a really good slide just because it kind of summarizes some of the key details of each of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but it doesn't go so deep into detail that kind of glazes your eyes over. In my mind, just in terms of reviewing what it is, you need to remember key points about the Congress. This is the power. This is the PowerPoint slide to remember. The only thing I would really highlight here is just to take another second, is that criteria for office issue. The criteria for office, the differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate, in my mind, you cannot speak any clearer than going back to those traditions of one house is for the people, one house is for the lords and for the highborn, right? The Senate is, you have to be older, you have to be a citizen longer, and then you're elected longer because we want you to be more stable. We want you to not have to worry about getting reelected all the time and thus be as emotional as these people down here. But we also need a house that does represent that younger, more progressive aspect, the change that is America. Why every 2 years? Because not for nothing, America can really change every 2 years in terms of our culture, our issues, our topics. That's why we have the Senate, that even though stuff changes all this much, let's have this group of politicians, and they're the professionals, they're keeping the stuff nice and calm. And you see that kind of relationship in the criteria for office. Questions? Any questions? So we talk about legislative powers, the powers that Congress has. Okay. So what you don't know, but is important for you to know. Article 1, Section 8 is where the Constitution lays out all the powers. That's not what I need you to know. What I need you to know is all powers in the Constitution given to the federal government are called expressed powers. They are expressly put in the Constitution. Specifically, Article 1, Section 8, line 37. They're an expressed power. Okay. So when we're talking about the different powers and laws that the Congress has, they are expressed in the Constitution, specifically given to the Congress. Now, Clause 18, okay, it's an important clause in the Constitution, and it's pretty simple. It basically says any powers not stated in the Constitution, but which are necessary and proper to carry out the expressed powers the Congress has. So let me say this again. Any powers not in the Constitution, but which are necessary and proper to carry out those expressed powers in the Constitution, Congress has those powers too. Those are called the implied powers. The implied powers. Okay,
Can you give an example of that?
Yep, absolutely. So Congress has the power to make the budget. It is expressed in the Constitution that Congress has the power to make the budget. It does not say anywhere in the Constitution that the federal government or Congress has the right to make a bank to run U.S. economic systems, a federal banking system. Doesn't say it anywhere in there. So there had to be a series of federal cases, went to the Supreme Court, judged by, in which it was recognized that the power to create a federal banking system is an implied power because it is necessary and proper to maintain the federal budget. Does that make sense? And when you start thinking about all the things that Congress has to make laws on that weren't in the Constitution. So for instance, the implied powers clause is vital to understanding why some people think Congress gets involved in too much stuff. It doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that the federal government should regulate the environment. But an implied powers approach says, in order to maintain public safety, maintain the stability of the US economy, the federal government must also have the necessary and proper ability to regulate the environment. So that necessary, look at that. Well, this is what you call transition, people. The necessary and proper clause is why the American government's power seems to stretch like a rubber band. And it's why they call it the elastic clause, because the Congress has this set power that was given in the Constitution. Damn it, this is what you can do. If it ain't there, you shouldn't be able to do it. But Clause 18 says there's a whole lot of other things that we have to be able to do in order to satisfy this couple of things that we said we're going to do. That's the elastic clause part. Did that example help?
Yes, thank you.
And again, I cannot stress this enough. There is not a single part of American culture, society, economics, politics that hasn't been impacted by the elastic clause. The elastic clause has been used to cover everything from how do we judge and expand and protect the concept of privacy? How do we deal with international immigration? How do we, if it wasn't in the Constitution and somebody in Congress thinks that they need to do that to do something in the Constitution, Congress makes a play to get that power. They, in their minds, they're not being, they're not being power hungry. They're not trying to corrupt things. In their minds, hey, listen, we should be able to pass a federal law on immigration because that's necessary and proper for our expressed power of helping to maintain national security. And other people go, specifically southwestern states go, hold on a second. We don't want somebody in Washington, D.C. that's never lived in Texas or Arizona, doesn't know what the immigration problem is. We don't want you folks setting the law. That doesn't make any sense. It should be a state level thing. So you get that compromise conflict dynamic, and it's the elastic clause. Maybe this is a good analogy. It is that elastic clause of rubber band that keeps the states from finally going, you know what, Civil War Part 2. We're tired of this. It's that constant give and take between the conflict between state and federal government and the need to compromise to keep the entire country together that really, that again, these are the genius moments in my mind of the founding fathers. Whatever else you want to say, whatever other criticisms you want to offer, yes, 2/3 of them owned slaves. This is brilliance. Building into the very system something. I mean, they're spending all this time, and then somebody goes, you know what? Let's put something in there that says, yeah, you know what? If we missed anything, but y'all need to do it in the future, you can do it. I don't know. Maybe I'm overly impressed by politics, but I find it fascinating. And when you consider that, except for the Civil War, it has kept, hell, I'd even say the Elastic Clause kept us together as a Civil War. It was the Elastic Clause that allowed Lincoln to work with Congress to maintain a federal government throughout the same exact time that war was taking place, not 90 miles from Washington, D.C. Every major battle in the East was fought within a 3 to 5 hour march of the capital of the United States. I would argue just about any other country of the world would have imploded within the first year. Not only did we not break up, we kept government functioning to the point that as a nation, we came out of the Civil War 5 times stronger than we ever were going in. I don't know why that happened.
I do have a question though, real quick, regarding the implied powers. So you stated that in order for them to use an implied power or put one into effect, it has to go through Congress and be passed and do all the different types of steps.
Yeah, they can't just say, no, we can do. And again, that's talking about the checks and balances part.
Right.
One of the keys is that if either of the other branches of government, the president or mostly the president, but even other members of Congress feel like something's not happening in accordance with the Constitution, that's what the judicial branch is for. And so they'll listen to the law, and that law doesn't go into effect. And I mean, listen, this has happened with everything from abortion to tax laws to education laws to desegregation to all of these different things were claimed in one way or another as an implied power, right? One of the big issues for the South after the Civil War was, even though we lost the war, yes, we've changed these systems, we've adopted these federal systems. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows the federal government to dictate culture to individual states. That was the foundation of segregation. The separate but equal was the fundamental finding that, okay, the federal government can enforce these basic laws, and they might even be able to stretch that rubber band a little bit to things like taxes and law enforcement. But you cannot get into individual homes, private property, private businesses, and tell me what discrimination is. And that's when the federal government had to go, fine, separate but equal. As long as you have 2 separate cars, you're not discriminating. As long as you have 2 separate counters, you're not discriminating. But I ultimately can't keep you from discriminating because the federal government doesn't have the right to intervene in individual lives. That was the theme for a long time. So you ask for examples, boom, here's 20 of them. 20 different examples. And I think one of the really interesting aspects of this is that not only do you see how this system works, right? So enumerated, okay, that's the same term as expressed. It's the same exact thing. An enumerated power is an expressed power. They just use the term expressed because it's expressly put in the Constitution. Some people like the enumerated term because it refers to the individual numbering of powers within the Constitution. Okay, so the things that this slide point out that are really important. Powers in the Constitution, enumerated, are clearly in the federal government's favor. There are also powers that are shared, right? Concurrent. Concurrent means both the state and federal governments have the ability to use that power. So, for instance, states all had their own banks, some private, some state, it was whatever. Once the federal government fought and established the right to have its own federal bank, now it becomes a concurrent power and all the things that have to go with it. That's when Congress says, okay, now we have a bank. We need to have some ability to manage the stock market, manage investment systems, manage trade. And so again, this expansion, this stretching of the law of Congress. Now, the term reserved powers, and again, I'm pretty sure we went through all this, right? This isn't brand new to anybody. Okay. So the reserved powers are the powers not in the Constitution, not enumerated or expressly given to the federal government. Thus, they are reserved by the states. If you guys remember yesterday, I was talking about how absolutely stunningly boring the issue of state compacts are, state treaties over stuff like water, sharing energy. The reason they're so important is that the federal government does not have the right to regulate trade within a state. That's why individual states have the right to set everything from regulations on weight limits on roads to what signage to, I don't know if anybody's ever been to another state where suddenly they're like, man, these signs are different and the way they paint the roads are different. Like it's different. Like each state has the right to regulate their own trade. It's only once you trade with the state next door or with the country across the river that you then get into the federal government's power to regulate trade. Go ahead.
So would that be like tolls
Yep.
on the interstate?
Yep.
Okay.
So to give you an example, and I think I talked about Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? One of the things that was taking place during that period of time, 70s into the 80s. You have to remember during the 1970s, there was an oil embargo by OPEC and gasoline tripled in prices and da-da-da. Long story short, by the late 1970s, early 1980s, the United States was looking for all sorts of ways to diminish our reliance on oil. And one of the thoughts was if we can make travel, interstate travel, safer and more efficient, then, in the end, we'll be saving money, we'll be saving lives. And how do we do this? We mandate a 55-mile speed limit. Does anybody remember this? Anybody familiar with this? It wasn't always that way. There were states that had no speed limit at all. So the question becomes, how does the federal government get all these states to adopt a speed limit when ultimately the federal government can't tell states what the speed limits are? Well, first, they do have jurisdiction on federal highways. So they mandate it on federal highways. Then what they do is they say, okay, we can't force you to make all your 55-mile-an-hour speed limits. But what we can do is tie that to your federal funding for highways. So if you don't adopt a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, we will reduce the money available to you to maintain your highways. Anybody ever notice that the highways in the South tend not to be as highly maintained as the highways in the North? That the highways in the Midwest tend not to be as well maintained? The federal highways are. But man, you drive some of those small routes through backwoods Nebraska, man, you're like, okay, I think this used to be asphalt at some point, but now it's like a derby road. I don't know what's going on here. And that's because by the 1990s, this dynamic, you're also seeing it as the reason why there are an increasing number of states who are now no longer requiring motorcycle helmets. In the end, the federal government can't make that a law. But what they did was they tied it to federal incentives for money that made it make sense. But this new push, frankly, this increased focus on anti-federalism, on a resistance to the federal government as a dominant force in one's life, is causing more and more states to resist and be willing to give up those incentives. I'm not going to take federal education money if it means I have to incorporate certain curriculum. I'm not going to take federal money if it means I then have to force all the people to take vaccinations. It's a steamroller. And those discussions you hear happening, they're all related to this idea that the federal government only has so much ability to create law within individual states. And if the people of those states decide, for instance, I don't care what the incentives are, we are not going to require strict gun rights or gun laws. In fact, we're going to call it the constitutional right to carry. They've lost now. They're losing federal funding and access to things like support for law enforcement, training, all these things that the government says they can get if they just do this. In their minds, it's no longer worth it. So what we're going to see is an increasing gap between services delivered between different states. For me growing up, the gap that always was reminded to me, and it's funny because it literally starts to create prejudice and bias across regions. In the North, it is very evident and it is repeated often how little money Southern states spend on public education and how that then affects their population, things like entrepreneurship. It's it's as much of the Northern biases against the South as the South has biases against the North about things like overcrowding and crime and all that. There's 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 truth in almost every bias. Doesn't mean it's the truth, but there are dynamics that exist. And part of that difference is driven by the idea that Southern states do not like the various federal requirements that come along with the incentives and the money. Questions? I just kind of rambled on
Does
for a
this
bit.
does this work the same way, for instance, if the state wanted to do something that the federal government didn't want them to do, as far as like,
Yes.
okay,
So there
like with
are
this critical race theory, can states decide? That's the one example that's coming to my mind.
oh no, it's absolutely I am expecting a letter probably sometime this year. I expect a letter from somebody within the Missouri legislature asking whether or not I teach critical race theory, and then now I don't know where it'll go from there. But I'm fully expecting that conversation. And what's really
Okay.
funny, you guys have gotten a really good dose of how I teach. Um, I don't dance around anything, okay? But I try really hard, and I'm not going to say I'm always successful, but I try really hard to be as objective and balanced as I can. Um, and so for me, it's kind of ironic that I've been teaching the same way for 20 years, but suddenly somebody tells me that I'm a threat to our culture. The great irony is I believe I'm a symbol of our culture, a willingness to question and learn and dig everything, everything's open book. There shouldn't be any closets for skeletons to fall out of. I don't know how else to put it. That means you're hiding stuff, and if we're all doing this together, let's do it right, man. And if that means we got to go back and go, you know what, that was messed up, so be it. Doesn't mean Crystal or me or Kieran or anybody's messed up now. It just means we're trying to understand how we got here and how can we make moving forward better. All right. But yes, I do think, and again, to be clear, it's um these issues go all the way back to things like whether or not Catcher in the Rye should be taught in 8th grade English. Okay, so I mean, obviously the topic du jour is critical race theory, but this dynamic, this goes back to whether or not tobacco. You have to understand, back in the 1950s, the second you left class, if you went down to the teacher's office, every teacher in that room was smoking a cigarette. I mean, we evolved, we learned, and it was a constant back and forth between, how do we do this? How do we establish this stuff? It's one thing to talk about civil rights, it's another thing to pass the bill. It is a whole nother ball of wax to figure out how we're going to compromise between promoting the civil rights bill and the real conflict and tension that exists within the American governmental system between the states and the federal government. Questions? I have a sneaking suspicion that this is a much more interesting conversation to me than it might be to you guys, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. I'm one of those strange people that actually likes to watch the sausage getting made. That's how I determine whether or not I'm going to eat it. I know sausage being made is an ugly thing, but I've worked in restaurants all my life, and whether we're talking politics or food, even the ugly stuff, when you're making it, is good. You know what? You ever see a sloppy Joe while it's being made? It's not the prettiest food in the world, but it's good if you make it right. And so that's kind of how I think politics, man. I show me the ugly stuff too. I need to know this because then I'll know when my senator did a good job, when Congress is doing well. How do I know that this president is good or bad? Because I know the last president was good or bad. That's how I think of it. So anybody remember that Schoolhouse Rock thing? I'm a Bill. I'm just a Bill. Yeah, I know. You have to understand. That was like the top. That was all we had when we were growing up, was like PSAs and Saturday morning cartoons. Y'all spoiled, grew up with Nickelodeon and all that. We didn't have any of that. So we had to rely on stupid things that taught us things like, how does a bill become a law? If you've never seen it, it's the classic public service announcement of all time. Anyway, a bill becoming a law is a process, as you can see. Okay. And when you're talking about the sausage being made, this is the process. From soup to nuts, this is how it works. The bill gets introduced. What does that mean? Generally speaking, it means a sitting representative or senator has made a recommendation for a new law. Okay, that's where this all starts. Now, what starts that can be any number of things. Maybe there's a mass shooting, and so suddenly somebody wants a new gun law. They step on the floor. I would like to introduce Bill 101.62, outlaw assault weapons. Then the process begins. Now, the very first step of the process is that someone refers the bill to the appropriate committee for consideration. All 435 representatives do not start talking about gun laws. They send it to a specific committee, maybe the Committee on Public Safety. So now these 14 representatives are the ones that talk about the initial bill. What should it look like? What should be in it? What shouldn't be in it? So you tend to get a relatively, you ever heard the term bipartisan committee? That's what they're talking about. That's the moment, right? Now, yes, it's supposed to be bipartisan, but do you remember who I told you makes the committees? The Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House and or the head of the Senate. Okay? Because remember, the only thing the vice president does in the Senate is cast that deciding vote. The leader of the Senate is, just like the representatives, whoever is in charge of the dominant party in the Senate, right? And so those individuals make the committee. So not for nothing, yeah, it's bipartisan, but 7-6, that's bipartisan. And the committee chair, yeah, that's sure as heck going to be a Democrat. So yeah, it's a bipartisan committee, but if I want to get the committee doing a certain thing a certain way, I just have to pick who's on it. Boom. You follow so far? Okay. So the subcommittee reviews the bill. So to be clear, Congressman Bob sat in his office and literally wrote the law. But until it becomes a law, it's called a bill. And so this subcommittee goes through and edits it and what's called marking it up. Markup is what it sounds like. Adding, subtracting, red line. How can we rewrite this, make it better, get it so that everybody's going to agree? Okay. Then the committee votes on it. Okay. To be clear, the committee, and I need to be clear, this large committee actually makes a subcommittee just for that bill. That's what that step is. So the 14 people, they send 3 people from that committee into a subcommittee to work on the bill. Because the big committee has all this other stuff they're working on too. But we got to get this bill reviewed. So you 3, you're the subcommittee for the gun law and automatic weapons. You guys review it and mark it up, edit it. They come back, they give it to the big committee. Now, for the record, out of this subcommittee, if they don't all in favor of the final version, the bill's dead. That's the end of the bill. The 3 guys in the room, they agree, they like what they came up with, they send it back to the committee. Guess what? They mark it up again. They review it again. If they vote on it and they all agree to pass, or at least a majority, then it moves on to the actual chamber. Is this making sense so far? In other words, there are 2 layers of review before any bill is ever voted on the floor of either the House of Representatives or the Senate. 2 layers. And that bill can die, and that's actually the term. The bill died in the committee. That means that the committee was not able to create a structure that they could all agree on to move on to the next phase. So the chamber now, so we're talking about the entire House of Representatives or the entire Senate. The entire chamber debates it. So now they can't make your edits They're not marking it up, but they are debating it. They are able to do things like add something. Okay, I can't change anything, but I want you to add a clause that gives extra money to offset the loss of jobs in my state to anybody that was working for a gun industry because they're going to lose money. Okay, we'll put that in there. That's when that happens. Then they vote. If the chamber votes it down, bill's dead. Okay. If they pass it, so now it's the third stage, it goes to the other chamber. Okay. So if it passed the final step here's the example. This is how impeachment worked both times. It went through the House. They referred it to the Ethics Committee. The Ethics Committee made a subcommittee called the Impeachment Committee. They went through the impeachment document, what they were going to keep in, what did they want to charge Trump with, what weren't they going to charge Trump with. They liked the final copy, they passed it, it's sent up to the regular committee. They did the same thing. In the end, they had the charges they had. The House impeached Donald Trump. Now it goes to the Senate. It did not progress past the conference committee. It was not going to go in front of the chamber with a passing vote. There was no way it was going to pass the Senate chamber. So although it was considered in the committees, in the end, the vote failed. Impeachment never happened, not in the Senate. And thus the final impact of that impeachment, censure, potentially being removed from office, never kicks in. Okay, and this works whether it starts in the Senate and goes to the House, whether it starts in the House and go to the Senate. It's got to be considered by both chambers, and it's got to go through this triple process in both chambers. If it's passed by both chambers, it then goes to the president. If the president does not sign it, it's called a veto, then it goes back to the chambers and they get a second chance to vote on it. It doesn't go through committee again. So it's not going through all that edit stuff. It just goes back to the chambers and it says, okay, if you can pass this bill again with 2/3 majority instead of just 51%, the president's signature doesn't matter. You've overrid his veto, and hallelujah, the bill has become a law.
In regards to the impeachment, though, I'm assuming a president wouldn't sign that.
No, here's the president's signature component. What would happen then? And you want to talk about a great irony. And this is what Trump really, again, his ability to control his branch of government was relatively unquestioned. And so the interesting thing about it is, and I don't know if anybody remembers this from the discussion, but the executive branch of government is the enforcement branch. So there were significant questions over whether or not and how Congress would be able to get the Department of Justice to enforce a potential impeachment. That was a question, even if it had passed both. I don't know if anybody heard like the rumors Trump's not going to leave office, Trump's going to stay in there, they're going to have to remove him, and blah, blah. A lot of that stuff was driven by the idea that the executive branch has complete control over the Department of Justice, which in turn has control over all law enforcement in the country. So the question was, why would he order his own branch, his own agency to remove him? And would they do it on their own? So there were all sorts of interesting dynamics and interactions between checks and balances. But again, in my mind, I step back and I look at the total picture and I think to myself, I think it's amazing that we held everything together as a society through, I mean, it wasn't, listen, in the big scheme of things, anybody that's truly upset and horrified, the Capitol insurrection, it was a dark moment. I'm not my own opinion, but it's nothing compared to the upheaval and insurrection that took place during the 1960s. It is a backyard bouncy house party compared to the level of violence and destruction that was taking place in this nation on almost a monthly basis during the 1960s. And so in my mind, I always try and keep that comparative aspect in place as well. Questions on how laws become a bill or how bills become a law? All right, I think that's the last slide coming up. Okay. So now the fun part. Let's criticize Congress. What is the criticism? So let's start with the easy one, especially considering our discussion yesterday. One of the primary arguments against special interest groups is that against Congress is that they are particularly affected by special interest groups. You remember our whole discussion yesterday? We talked about lobbying. Well, if you hate the lobbyists, then you got to kind of hate the people that are using the lobbyists, the people who are benefiting from the lobbyists, and that's your congressman. That the special interests don't exist if there's not a congressional person for them to try and influence. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's one of those things that again, you remember me early on talking about I don't blame the driver for the drunk car accident, or I don't blame the car for the drunk driving accident. I blame the driver. And so I've always thought about that in terms of Congress as a body, as an institution, as a constitutional structure versus the individual politicians in it. So in my mind, I'm not sure we need to do away with special interest groups or even lobbying. I just think it needs to be much more regulated, much more structured in terms of who's getting the influence of these individuals and how, in fact, is it impacting politics in America. Now, the other one that's really easy to get through here is this inefficiency gridlock. We actually already talked about that. And again, I would argue that it's kind of a perspective thing. One person's gridlock is another person's successful hindrance. You know what I mean? Of policy, but in the end, I don't think you can't dismiss the argument that Congress is inefficient. It is absolutely there. But I think what we do dismiss is that it is inefficient precisely because I want it to represent me, not America. Okay, I'll let that hang in the air for a second. There's not a single congressman, representative, senator that was sent there to represent America. Every politician is elected to represent the people that elected them. As much as compromise is baked in, my own opinion, so is conflict. Go ahead, Crystal.
When you say the gridlock, is that like in reference to like the government shutdowns when they can't agree on stuff, or is that something completely?
Nope. The gridlock, or listen, we have gridlock on infrastructure right now. The idea that Congress could not come together to come up with a second package to help cushion the impact of COVID, it's criminal in my mind. I'm sorry. It's just, listen, it's one thing you want to argue about something that's on a slow burn. Okay, so we don't fix the bridge until next year. We don't improve this, for a couple of years, whatever. But when we're talking about the impact of COVID on this country, I just find it appalling the degree to which politics on both sides was utilized as a weapon that ultimately has now disadvantaged populations, has caused significant questions over the value of things like vaccination. How does all this stuff trickle down to our regular life? Let me give you an example. I'm planning Welcome Week for the university right now. One of the most critical questions is, how are we going to incorporate COVID? How are we going to regulate? Are we going to require masks? Can we afford to do social distancing? Do we have to? The CDC says this, but the CDC is a federal system that can't then be used to regulate state commerce. So only states can decide and most states, especially states in the South, in turn say, okay, we actually let jurisdictions make these decisions. So now COVID regulation is fundamentally different between Jeff City and Columbia. Between when the people show up at Lincoln University to go through the line to register, and we require everybody to take a mask, and then we're going to put them on shuttles so they can go and explore the Capitol and the downtown, but none of the downtown and Capitol require masks. These are the sorts of breakdowns that you see in systems that are suffering from inefficiency and gridlock. But it's important to understand there's a reason. Because as much as it sounds really good, if we had a federal guideline and mandate on mask wearing, the reality is our country is built on the idea that that's exactly what we don't want. I will figure out whether or not I want to get a vaccine, whether or not I want to get a mask. That's my great freedom as an American. But it runs very contrary to the very concept of a single society, of a community. Is this making sense? You know, it's way too early in the morning for this stuff, Dr. Watson. You almost done? My cinnamon rolls are about to come out. All right, I get it. I get it. Pork barrel. Anybody ever heard that term before? Pork barrel? Okay. Simple, short, direct. Pork barrel. Remember I was telling you that when it gets to the back to the main chamber, they can't edit anything else. They can just add stuff or subtract stuff. The stuff that is added and subtracted in the chamber negotiations, that's pork barrel. So again, let's go back to I want to pass a law that says we're going to build 2 new military bases, and we're going to build them in these states, X and Y. And state Z says, well, if you build it there, I'm going to lose some of the personnel, some of the people that are on the base. In fact, my entire state is going to lose economy because now you're shifting Air Force operations to this new base in another state. So the guy that wants to pass the bill says, you know, well, how can I get you to still support the bill? I understand it's going to negatively impact your state, but I need your support. He says, fine, I want you to build a brand new National Guard facility in my state. That's the deal. I'll support this bill, even though my state's going to lose out from the U.S. military perspective if you turn around and add money to the National Guard. Done. I've just added pork barrel to the bill. Why? That's not what the original bill was designed for. Does that make sense? Anybody remember Sarah Palin? One of the things that she got knocked for during the election was the idea that there was a bridge in Alaska that literally ended at the end of a river and just went into the wilderness. That was a pork barrel project that she ended up getting embarrassed on. She had cut a deal in an earlier level of negotiations to get a highway built from her town to the next town. But the problem was the money in the bill wasn't enough to complete the highway. So it literally only went halfway and ended in the middle of the forest. And when the Democrats found out during the election, that was big news for about 3 weeks. That's how this stuff happens, is that we're all right, I need to get this law passed. Let me give Courtney whatever it's going to take to get her to sign this bill. And if it means I build a highway to nowhere just to make her constituents feel better about her leadership, I'll pay the price. And yes, there have been bills, please, the 2005 Consolidated Appropriations, remember that word, Act, 11,000 additional pork barrel earmark. The reason it's called an earmark is when you see the bill, it's actually this little drawing on the side that says this was added in, and it looks like a little pig ear, basically. And so that's why they call it an earmark, each of those individual ones. 11,000 additional things were added onto that bill during negotiation in the chamber. And again, and this is the sort of thing, so we're talking about a bill that might have been $1 billion to start. How much more money do you think got added to that bill when they had to fund 11,000 new projects? That's how you get $1 billion. That's how you get a $700 billion COVID stimulus package designed to help this or that turn out to be $1.7 billion, trillion dollars. Because now I have to fund all these other projects that I need to put in the bill to get all these other people to support the original idea. That's how it works. And I would argue that is absolutely one of the primary complaints against Congress. But again, to me, we step back. It is not Congress being corrupt. They're not being malicious. They're not stealing. You know what they're doing? They're looking back at me and you, the people that elected them, and saying, yes, this is a great bill for the country, but what the heck are you going to give my people? Because if you're not giving my people something, they're not going to elect me. And so why would I support this bill if it doesn't help me and my people? In the end, it's us. It reflects us. So as appalling as we might be sitting here looking at a PowerPoint, if we were living in one of those communities that got all that money for one of those 11,000 projects, we're not complaining. Does this make sense? Sorry, this is one of my other shoes moments. In my mind, not everybody is unhappy with things. Somebody's going to benefit. And most of the time, the reason why this looks so crazy is more because individual Americans are competing with each other. My community is competing with Courtney's community and is competing with Sarah's community over this finite budget, over COVID funding. So you know what? I'm going to elect a guy that's going to go to Congress and make sure Missouri and Jeff City and HBCUs get money. And my guy's going to have to fight with Crystal's guy to get that money. That's American politics. Courtney.
So this might be completely irrelevant, but it just popped in my head. Okay, so we're talking about how, the House and the Senate passed the bills and, the president signs off on them, right?
Yep.
Okay, so when, and this is just a question, so when Trump was in office and these bills were passed to give, I think it was like a new art museum somewhere, and then to send to the Middle East money for gender studies, stuff like that. And the president's, he talked, or past president, he talked about how, giving these countries, money for gender studies was ridiculous, right? But doesn't he sign off on that?
Well, one of the things that happens.
And I know this is an American. I know. I
No,
mean,
no,
it
no.
has to
This
with
is
America, but
absolute. No, this is absolute. Okay, so let me give you an example that I actually have studied very closely. One of the things the United States absolutely supports and promotes is slow, steady population growth. Rapid population growth, especially in poor countries, underdeveloped countries, is a number one reason why governments, economic, and political systems tend to break down because the population is growing faster than the country can support. You with me so far? So during the 2000s, during the 1990s, you could almost call it the golden age of the United Nations. We were expanding programs to try and assist in population growth issues around the world. We were supporting multiple UN agencies, everything we could. There's a very clear divide in America over the issue of not just abortion, but family management. And so the conservative element within Congress was very clear. We do not believe the United States should be giving money to any programs that promote the use of prophylactics. That was a fundamental issue in U.S. international healthcare policy. It's actually the beginning of the break between the United States and the UN Health Agency that was tracking COVID. I don't know if you guys know that there were some significant issues between the International Health Agency and how they were reporting and dealing with COVID, and the Trump administration, how they were reacting. And to the end that then, if I remember correctly, there was a point at which the international organization actually might have put out some data that was wrong initially. And a lot of people took that to be the see proof. You're not reporting, you're not being tough on China. There were a lot of very clear complaints. This literally all goes back to the break between how do we take the congressional perspectives that were originally contained within these laws. And for instance, Courtney, to put this in perspective, the law we'd be focusing on is like the every year the Congress has to pass a law that determines how we distribute monetary aid around the world, who we're going to give it to, how much, did they meet our regulations, our guidelines? You have to have a democratic system, you have to do this. Then we decide to give the law. It's in that congressional bill that we then decide, nope, please put in there any state that mandates prophylactics and high schools is not allowed to get the money out of this bill. So literally what's going on in the Congress affects the world because the United States has so much money to give out to these sorts of things. Health, I don't know if anybody's ever studied it, but what I'm talking about, this interaction between congressional and American political views, and the international system, to me, the biggest example in my lifetime, even bigger than COVID, was the relationship between U.S. political engagement with the AIDS outbreak in the 80s and 90s, and how that then impacted not just policy in America, but you could see different approaches within different states and regions. And then that in turn really impacted how the rest of the world engaged AIDS. How do you talk about AIDS? How do you talk about getting AIDS under control and at the same time deal, for instance, with the homophobia that was much more rampant in America at the time? Dealing, how do you talk about the number one way of stopping AIDS being the use of prophylactics in a political culture that doesn't believe you should promote prophylactic use? These were significant problems for our approach at the time. I don't know. Is anybody remembering any of this stuff? Or
Yes.
I hope I answered your question, Courtney. I know I tend to talk too much at times, but other thoughts or questions? I hope this stuff is connecting, and I know I tend to try and give a lot of historical examples and backgrounds, but I think at least some of you, when I throw down the basic concept or the basic framework, it's like, okay, but it's actually the example that might bring home the understanding.
Yeah.
So that's why I do that.
I agree with that. For me, that works very
Cool,
well
cool.
because
No, I just listen. Drives my wife crazy because I end up basically explaining the same thing to her 3 different ways over the course of 2 days. Because in my head, if I don't turn it around and I don't get it from the different angles, I'm not going to really get it. And she's like, okay, I get it. So you don't have to talk about it anymore. But so this concept of log rolling, all log rolling is that's when it's actually has nothing to do with the project. I don't need Crystal to put in a new amusement park earmark in her bill just so I'll support it. This is just me and Crystal. We get together on the golf course on Saturdays. I got a bill coming up this week. Y'all help me out. Next time you get a bill, I got you. That's log rolling. The reason they call it log rolling is I don't even care what this bill is right now. I want to roll your need for my support into the next bill. I want to make sure that you know you owe me something the next time we sit at the table. Does that make sense?
Yep, I was just about to ask the difference between pork
Yep.
barrel and log rolling.
Yeah,
So
log rolling is basically it has nothing to do with right now for me. Whatever, you know, you need to build, but you need my help. So I need a chip in my pocket. You're gonna owe me something. You're gonna scratch my back when I ask you to. That's the difference. Now, franking privilege. That's one of those things that sometimes I even wonder when I first start talking about it. It's like, why am I even putting this on here? Franking privilege is free use of mail. When you're a senator, the argument was, and we're going all the way back to the institution of the American postal system in the 1910s, okay? So this is a long-standing issue. Back in the day, when Crystal wanted to go from her congressional seat in DC back home to North Carolina, guess what? She got on a horse or in a wagon and literally had to ride home. That means communications with your home district were slow. So in order to try and maintain all the congressmen and all the representatives in Washington, D.C., I'll give you free postal. That way you can send as many letters as you want back and forth to your people back in Carolina, Virginia, New York, wherever it is, and you still stay in DC and do the business. Everybody with me so far? Then the go ahead.
Sorry, so basically
Nope.
it's abusing the postal system?
Then the modern system kicked in. How do I translate the franking privilege to free internet access, free use of internet marketing services, all of those additional things that politicians do in the modern age that technically fall under mailing? Not for nothing, back in the day, we're talking about, me sending, 500 letters a month back home. Man, maybe that's a lot. Now I'm sending out 50,000 emailings a day. And that doesn't even count. And so the argument is, why is it a criticism of Congress? Because now I can take that concept of the franking privilege and I can basically get the American people to pay for my entire campaign, or at least the marketing part of it and all the mailing part of it. Anything that involves something that technically is a franking privilege that's covered by taxes. Questions? Any last questions, comments, thoughts, ideas? Ran over a little bit, but you guys aren't on my Facebook and stuff, but you should know I talked about you guys on my Facebook page yesterday. It's really kind of been bugging me after our class yesterday. It's really hit me that this is probably my last class. I'm trying not to jinx myself, but I really feel good about what I've been able to accomplish in this position so far, and the things that we're getting done as a group, And so I have every intention of